Mr. John Christensen. You were just telling me before when we were sitting down about how you actually grew up in Jersey.
Yeah, so although my family background is peculiar, my mother was a war refugee from Germany, and my father was Danish, and he spent the war as a teenager in the Danish resistance. They ended up in London, which is where they met.
Wow.
The flotsam and jetsam of war, and they went on honeymoon to Jersey in the late 1950s. Liked the place so much that they stuck there, and that happens to a lot of people. They go to islands and end up there. So I grew up in Jersey. I went away to university and training and so on. Lived in London and travelled a lot. Worked in the UK civil service at quite a high level, and then went back to Jersey and was, for a while, I was working in the offshore finance industry out of intellectual curiosity, because we're talking now about the late 1970s, early 1980s, and this new phenomenon of offshore finance was beginning to become a really serious player in the global economy. And no one was really studying it in any objective sort of way. And everyone was treating it as some kind of harmless, rather marginal activity. But I had a hunch it was something much, much bigger than that. And I went offshore in order to get a feel from the inside. And for a while I worked with Deloitte, one of the big four accounting firms. And that was very helpful, because working from inside the system, it kind of turns all the economic theory that I learned at university on its head. And then I was headhunted
because people aren't perfectly rational. And
isn't that odd? People aren't perfectly rational, but also, to be honest, a lot of economic theory is built upon one assumption which is nonsense, building on another assumption which is nonsense, and arriving in 2 + 2 makes 76 or something.
If the very first assumption is that the consumer will behave and consume rationally, the second you introduce one small color into your advertising, it takes it out.
Yeah,
Immediately.
exactly.
And that's the most tiny little change you could make, let alone the bombardment of advertising and marketing and everything else that actually is involved with how people behave.
Yeah, exactly. But I'll take it one step further, because for my first degree, I was looking at international trade and investment. So really kind of getting in there at the deep end. And I went to a university which specialized in that. And in the course of 3 years, they never once mentioned offshore, even though the vast majority of trade between nations is booked through offshore structures, and the vast majority of capital movements are booked through offshore structures. It was never mentioned once. And if I did mention it and say, well, hang around, let's start looking, for example, at capital movements into and out of Africa, they would say, oh, that's all because of bad economic policies in the African countries. And setting aside the fact that that's racist, guys, it was just junk economics.
Yeah.
I had a great fun.
So you've actually been involved in this offshore world for over 40 years, correct?
That's right.
What has the evolution looked like so far?
I think it's fair to say that the evolution from the I think what really got me going on this in 1978, I went to a seminar at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and there was a professor there who, in this area of international political economics, is regarded as the doyenne. She is the person. Her name is Susan Strange, and you mention Susan Strange to the people who know her, and they all say, yeah, she really understood these things. And she just said, this is an area that needs to be looked at, because no one is systematically looking at it. And I said, well, I'm from Jersey. And she said, well, in that case, you're in the perfect position to look at it. And my career was kind of made for me. From then on, I was an investigative economist. And things kind of fell into place, because it was, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Where people used to talk in billions, they started to talk in trillions of trade being booked through these places. And it was quite clear this was emerging not as a minor phenomenon, but as the major, possibly defining phenomenon. And there was something about it which I quickly grasped, and I think Susan had pushed me in that direction slightly, which was that not only was this bad for all of the people, the vast majority of people in the economies where this was happening, it was also undermining democracy. And from then on, I stopped thinking of it purely as an economic phenomena. I started thinking of it as a political economic phenomena, which was targeting democracy. And that's where my interest lay.
A major defining phenomena. Give me a sense for just how significant and overwhelming the role of offshore financial flows are in just my everyday life, maybe in the things I buy or even the economic opportunities that might be available to me, and then furthermore, who I can vote for.
Sure. Okay, so let's go back to the 1970s in Europe. Across Europe, we still had, in most cases, functioning, reasonably well-funded welfare states. People had access to not just free health services and education services. Most young people like me went to university and had our fees paid for, etc., etc., etc. Little by little, all of that has been eroded. And it's been eroded because big corporations now dominate the global markets, and the very wealthy billionaires who now dominate the wealth, they hold the vast majority of wealth and control it. They've simply put themselves beyond the ability of nation states to tax, and that's because of offshore. It's the existence of tax havens, but it gets worse because, one of my areas of interest lies in conservation, and I've kind of pursued this right the way through, and I as environmental issues have raised up the agenda and the public have become more aware of them, they've been demanding better regulation and tighter controls and better enforcement and push back against all these big corporations. But the big corporations have grown so politically powerful over the course of the last 40, 50 years that very, very few politicians or political parties dare to challenge them and say, yeah, we're going to impose better environmental regulations or better worker protections or better consumer protections, precisely because of the political power of the big corporations. And the big corporations are always saying the same thing. If you don't do it somewhere, if you don't give us this deregulation or lower taxes, we know somewhere that we can get the lower taxes or get the lesser regulation. So the offshore has driven, over the last 50 years, a process of race to the bottom, which has degraded the livelihoods of most people on the planet.
What do you mean, race to the bottom?
Whether it's taxation, and just thinking again about Europe, what's been happening is over the last 50 years is the tax charge has been going increasingly away from the wealthy and powerful corporations and wealthy and powerful individuals onto for example, onto consumers through value-added taxes or general sales taxes of one kind or another. And where we used to have quite progressive tax systems, in other words, tax systems where the wealthy carried a larger share, precisely because they were earning more money or because they had more wealth, little by little, those progressive tax systems have been undermined. And if you look at most tax systems in most parts of the world, at the very best, they're slightly progressive. But in most cases, they're regressive. In other words, poor people are paying...
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, poor people are paying a hell of a lot more tax as a proportion of their income and wealth than the wealthiest.
Let's take the United Kingdom as an example. Is it still the case that the majority of taxable receipts are coming from income brackets between £200,000 and £3 million of income per year? And therefore, although it sucks, it's less significant that people who earn over $3 million in income per year can, through all of these offshore mechanisms, bring their effective tax rate down to zero. But still, the majority of the government's income is coming from the taxable receipts of these moderately to very wealthy people between £200,000 and £3 million.
If we look at income tax, there is still a degree of progressiveness there. The very wealthy people, particularly the people who claim that they're not domiciled. Now, let's unpack what the hell that means, because famously, of course, the current Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak, his family affairs are non-domiciled. His wife is non-domiciled, and claim that at some stage they might leave England, and therefore they're not. They only pay tax on whatever income arises within Britain.
Shocking example of leadership.
But an interesting example of the issue, because I know from the work I did in Jersey that the vast majority of non-domiciled people arranged to only have enough income to pay for their gas and their heating bills and their groceries every day. So they don't actually pay they pay very little tax at all. That's changed slightly now because there's a minimum thing, but you know, that's the point. But if you look at other taxes, if you look, for example, at capital gains taxes, the vast majority of the very wealthy people are able, one way or the other, to game the system, to dress capital gains, income as capital gains. And the capital gains tax rate is vastly below the income tax rate. So obviously they have an incentive there. The vast majority of really wealthy people don't pay particularly much in inheritance taxes because they've set most of their wealth up in trusts of one kind or another. What we've seen is a huge shift of receipts towards value-added taxes. Everybody pays, no matter how poor you are, you're paying
True, absolutely.
value-added taxes.
And that's equally distributed amongst the economy as well.
That's right. Across the entire economy, what you've seen is a shift so that far more of there are far fewer exemptions targeted at lower income households. And of course, they have no wealth. So capital gains tax exemptions mean nothing to them whatsoever. But they're having to pay all of these other taxes. And on top of that, the big corporations have been able to game the global system. There are a lot of failures in the global system, so they can shift their profits to tax haven subsidiaries very easily, and still do. So you asked me earlier, has there been a great change? There have been some minor changes, largely because of civil society pressure coming from the Tax Justice Network, which I was a founder of. So we really pushed for some measures, but it's still the case that the vast majority of the big corporations that dominate the global economy can use intellectual property rights to maximize the gains they get from their monopoly positions within the economy, and pay next to no taxes because mysteriously all of their intellectual property rights have been parked in Bermuda or Cayman or Luxembourg or whatever. So the global tax system is still massively skewed towards the powerful corporations.
I'd like to understand this a little bit better. Why is it, and explain this economically if you can, why is this bad outcome downstream of corporations getting more power and not rather downstream of the demand for these offshore networks given the rise in wealth across the entire planet, not just in, say, Northern European and North American economies? First of all, does that question make sense?
I might have to kind of rework it.
Okay.
And bear with me. You might have to edit most of this out. But let's begin with the phase of globalization that started in the 70s and really picked up with Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan's kind of push towards what became known as the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus had four key pillars of it, which was, first of all, we're going to totally open up world trade so that the vast majority of countries will be involved in relatively free movement of... This is globalization. But what does it boil down to? It boiled down to freedom of movement of trade and goods and services, freedom for capital to roam the world, but interestingly, not labor. And let's get back to that in a second. That's a really important part. Freedom, cutting taxes and privatizing natural monopolies. Now, fast forward 40 years or 50 years, and where are we? We're in a position where virtually every natural monopoly in the world has been privatized. And in Britain, we can see the worst examples where privatized water companies are dumping sewage into our rivers.
Isn't that insane? Just as a quick aside, I learned this having come here in my trip now, but water is actually privately owned in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and this is astonishing. And for the greater part, the owners are international, in some cases governments, and in some government pension funds of one kind or other. And all they're interested in is maximising dividend payments. This is capitalism at its most insane, because the end result is all the investment that was supposed to go into the water sector, and particularly the foul water treatment sector, failed to materialise. And with my conservation hat on, I spend my time with teams trying to clean rivers up. Yeah. And it is totally insane. But getting back to what happened, as markets were liberalised, particularly finance markets, the idea was that, coming from the right wing, was that nation states would have to compete to attract capital. Now, how did they do that? Now, the theory, of course, was they would provide better infrastructure and better trained workforces and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. They did no such thing, certainly not in Europe. They failed to invest, by and large, in research and development. They reacted by cutting taxes, providing incentives, all sorts of tax incentives, providing infrastructure geared to the needs of big capital, not to the wider population. In other words, they geared their economies to the needs of big capital, and at the same time tried to subsidize their own big multinational companies so they could compete. And the mantra shifted from, the welfare state for the wider populations to, we must ensure that the competitiveness of our economy, and we do that by deregulating. They didn't use that term, deregulation. They used the term, and this is global, cutting red tape. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about what cutting red tape means in practice. It means cutting worker protections. It means cutting consumer protections. It means cutting environmental protections. You go on. What they've been doing is they've been gradually cutting away at all of the strands that make for a democratic checks and balances, but also what the people want. Worker protections, consumer protections. People need these things. And because, if you again look at Britain as an example, but again, you can talk about France, Germany, elsewhere, because the people got the sense that the politicians were no longer working on their side, the people became totally disillusioned with democracy. And little by little, the far right moved in on that and started pointing fingers, not at big capital who were wrecking the economy. They started pointing the fingers at immigrants, red tape, this, that, and the other. And now we are where we are, with the far right emerging as a dominant political force here in Europe and elsewhere in the world. The United States might well elect Trump. In other words, bad economics has created, and I blame it totally. I think that globalization was right at the heart of it, because the model of globalization they chose was totally geared to the interests of big capital. And coming out of that, we created the preconditions. It moved beyond neoliberalism into fascism. And and many of my colleagues, but I've been warning about that since the late 1980s. This was the obvious end direction that they were. This was the terminus they were driving towards.
Yeah. So when you mentioned that all of this cutting red tape, which was a euphemism for deregulation, all of a sudden, all the developed economies around the world could compete for this new market, which was these financial services. And in a competitive market, the price is brought very close to zero, which is why the corporate tax rates or the friendliness for these offshore systems were incentivized to be created because it was in competition with these other people.
Yeah, so, for a very long time, it was assumed that tax competition, that is competing against other countries by offering lower tax rates, would lead to a zero rate of corporate income tax.
Lead to market efficiency. It's like at the core of this philosophy.
Market efficiency, indeed. And from the 1980s onwards, particularly once I started working offshore in the tax haven world, it was clear that that was a complete nonsense. It wouldn't lead to a zero rate of tax. And there are some economists out there, kind of on the wingnut job, who think corporate income tax is a massive distortion. It's no such thing. Corporate income tax was designed and implemented to prevent the wealthy and powerful from putting all of their assets into corporations and avoiding tax entirely. So that's the background. But corporate income tax is a really important tax for all sorts of reasons. But the assumption was that this competitiveness, this race to the bottom, would lead to zero rates. No such thing. It would always lead inevitably to massive subsidies, because the competition would take you into negative territories. Nations would compete against one another to provide companies with direct subsidies. We'll provide you with, for example, with trained workforces. We'll build the infrastructure. We'll build your factories. We'll give you 10 years tax holidays on local rates and this, that, and the other. We'll do, you name it. We'll provide it. And it reached that moment of absurdity when Google set up a competition in the United States for who will host their second headquarters. And almost,
Amazon, no?
Sorry, Amazon, I beg your pardon. Amazon set up this competition, and you had states that were almost bankrupt, offering
Exactly.
billions
They were going
of
to
subsidy.
take a huge loss to bring it in.
Yeah, I mean, this was crazy. One of the richest companies in the world, if not at that time, the richest company, was going around bidding to get subsidies from bankrupt states. That was the trajectory, and we're saying someone has to, at a political level, someone has to take a decision to stop this insane race to the bottom. And interestingly, it was Biden who did that by putting a 15% minimum rate. It was at the time I said it was far too low. It should have been closer to 30%. And when I began my career, it was 50%. I mean, wow. So lacking in ambition. And funnily enough, Biden picked up on that. And in the summit, I think it was the G7 summit, he said, well, look, civil society, the Tax Justice Network is saying that the rate should be 30%. And at that time he was pushing for 21%. Eventually they settled at 15%. But what they did was they put a minimum threshold, and that stopped the race to the bottom.
And that was in direct reference to your work, was it?
I think that was.
Oh, wow.
We can claim some part to play in that, because we've certainly been pushing very heavily, and I knew that. I think State Secretary Janet Yellen, an economist, knew of our work, and she knew we were pushing it, and certainly the Financial Times had been picking up on my views on that and on that. So I think we can claim some credit for it, but I think it was remarkable that Yellen actually pushed it through.
Yeah. Talk to me about Ireland then in this case, because depending on which lens you look through, they're either a tremendous success story of lowering corporate income taxes to incentivize foreign businesses to come, or they are just another one of these examples of maybe it was good for a little while, but long term you're going to be in a lot of strife. So Ireland, I'll leave it with you from there.
Okay, I think Ireland is a really interesting case study, and I've looked at it very closely. And Nick and I have put out quite a few blogs and so on about Ireland. So a lot of people have pointed to the Celtic Tiger model and said, here's an example of competitiveness working in favour of one nation state. But I think there's a context to this, because if you look, Ireland's tax haven role began in mid-1950s and carried on, and there was no sign of the Irish economy really seriously picking up until something happened, and that something was they joined the European Union and they became a part of the European Union single market. And that made it very attractive to the bigger US corporations, because they then had a platform where happily they had a skilled working class,
English speaking.
English speaking, good infrastructure, a lot of intelligent people there. And yes, it had a low tax rate, which the US corporations loved, but most importantly, they had access to the single market. Now, alongside that, Ireland, when they joined, was a relatively low-income country, and the European Union put a huge amount of money into both social development and infrastructure development. And as a motorcyclist, I was very well aware of this, because if you drove on an Irish road, there were potholes and it was pretty dangerous. If you drove on one of the new European Union funded roads, they were lovely. But joking aside, they also benefited enormously from the common agricultural policy. In other words, the European Union's huge subsidies to their agricultural economy. So alongside the huge subsidies they were getting from the European Union, which were promoting their development right through the 80s, 90s, noughties, and so on, they were able to effectively run a low tax regime alongside all this European Union subvention. And conveniently for the politicians, they kind of emphasized the low tax, but didn't mention they were getting all this subsidy from the European Union. Right. So I think you have to understand the Celtic Tiger model in that context. They really picked up as a result of being members of the European single market.
It wasn't just one economic policy of reducing the corporate tax rates, which created the environment for all of these international corporations to come.
That's correct.
Then continue with the narrative. Now they are the home of many of the world's biggest software companies. Their European operations are headquartered there. What does the future look like for Ireland, a country which doesn't have really any other economic exports to be that stoked about, who themselves have their, like many other European countries, right-wing populist parties that are getting a lot of momentum off the back of get rid of all these immigrants who are like decimating our culture?
Yep. Well, first of all, hats off to them. I think that their economic policy, particularly of a lot of funding for education, they have built up a skilled workforce. They speak English. They've attracted a lot of bigger corporations, particularly in relatively high-value sectors. They have what's called a cluster effect. In other words, they've developed a large pool of expertise, and that's a win-win situation all round. They're well tapped into research development. They have moved to a relatively high productivity economy, and that's great. And I think that the relative political stability they've achieved contributes to that as well. And there's no question. I wouldn't say that low taxation has been a massive low level of corporate income tax has been a massive problem for them. Quite the opposite. It has attracted American companies, but the American companies would probably be attracted anyway by that cluster effect. All those high-skilled people, all that research and development, all that access to the European Union markets. It's a win-win situation.
And project into the future.
Well, I think that the future, I mean, it's very hard to say. At this moment, as we move into an era where artificial intelligence is going to transform large parts of the European and global economies, it's very hard to say what share the Irish economy is going to be able to take of that. But I think they're relatively well poised compared to other economies within Europe, precisely because of all those positive factors they have.
Right. All right, take us back to your childhood. You mentioned earlier that you grew up in a very anti-fascistic environment because of the experiences both your mother and father had gone through. And then very serendipitously, you actually ended up in this line of work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether that was the case. But I just worked more and more towards it. So my mother was a war refugee from Germany. Grew up in Berlin, but had to flee in the mid-1930s because of the rise of fascism and Nazism. My father grew up in Denmark, and of course Denmark was occupied. And for a while in his high school years, he was a messenger with the Danish resistance. They moved to London after World War II had finished, and met up and married. And they moved to Jersey following a honeymoon. They just loved the place, and I think they were both quite restless characters, and being on a small island suited them. And it was, I think it was growing up in Jersey that kind of gave me some extraordinary insights. It was a microcosm, because Jersey at that time was beginning to emerge as a tax haven, an adjunct, a satellite of London, the city of London. And what triggered that, strangely, was the arrival of jet aircraft, because Jersey could actually take jet aircraft at its airports and was the closest proper tax haven to the city of London, which means the city of London bankers and lawyers and financiers could fly out on what was called the red eye first thing in the morning, do their business offshore, sign all the papers and be home in time for dinner, thanks to the marvels of jet engines. And these people were clearly, and I grew up with them, socially we were always meeting. I went to school with the children of lawyers and bankers and accountants. What struck me was how fanatical they were in their contempt for democracy. They were all about setting things up so their clients could avoid tax, all about setting things up so their clients could avoid regulation or any kind of legal impediment. And they were quite fanatical about this. They were deeply antisocial people.
Really? That's funny.
I mean, in their own way, of course, they went out and they loved going to pubs and this, that, and the other, but they were contemptuous of the vast majority of people. And it's that was in-your-face stuff.
Is that an elitism which still permeates a lot of these white collar jobs?
That's an interesting question. I think it's kind of mutated. So if we go back to the late 60s, early 70s, when I was a kid growing up in my teenage years, I sensed there was a kind of imperialist hangover with a very strong tinge of racism, it has to be said, and deeply shaped by colonialism and a kind of post-colonial hangover. I think that mutated to through the 1980s and beyond into a kind of a sense of wider privilege and greed is good. Greed is good shaped a lot of the activities, and also this sense that, and this is where the bad economics comes in, we are the wealth creators. And my riposte to that was, well, actually, you're not creating wealth. Very few of you actually investing in new, exciting research or innovation of new products. You're wealth extractors. And a vast majority of the work being done, for example, in the City of London, was in the field of mergers and acquisitions. And that's not about creating exciting new products or bringing great new things to the market.
Consolidating.
This is all about, exactly. It's all about consolidation, baby. In other words, it's leading to monopolizations of the entire economy. And that's what I could see in microcosm in Jersey. This was all about the return of big monopoly, whether it's in the banking sector or whether it's in the IT sector or whether it's in the AI sectors. We should be very concerned indeed of the fact that they are all dominated by big monopolies who are extracting wealth from the economy. And far from that being good for the wider consumer, I think it's exactly the opposite. I think it's really harmful.
Can you explain just how weird the City of London is?
Where do we start? Wow. I mean, let's begin with the City of London Corporation, which is just because it's kind of anachronism, this medieval or even pre-medieval period anachronism. Politically, it's a corporation. It's a private enterprise of its own type with its own internal government and its extraordinary electoral college where the voting system to vote the alderman, note the ancient
From a
anachronistic.
medieval series of guilds.
You should meet the
Right.
people. They are medieval. Yeah. And the medieval guilds that
Some traditions
surround
die
it.
hard.
Yeah, and all that kind of ermine and wigs and all of that stuff hides really quite a sinister operation, because politically it is a very powerful lobby, and it's been played a very important part, I think, in the process of promoting competitiveness, which means, hey guys, we've got to deregulate finance. We've got to allow the banks to operate with the minimum of regulation and the minimum of taxation, because that's how we compete with New York or with Singapore or with Dubai or wherever.
This is around the 50s.
I think it began in the mid-1960s. No, I'm sorry. I think it began in the mid-1950s, somewhere around 1956, when they kicked off what became known as the euro-dollar market, which was an unregulated, initially dollars and all sorts of other currencies came in, but initially it was a dollar market in London, which fell outside of the regulatory regime of the United States Fed.
Is it true that they are, or rather, is it true that they are a country at the heart of London that is separate from the United Kingdom? Just help me understand politically how separated they are actually from the broader United Kingdom. Because from your marvelous documentary, Spider's Web, the implication is that they are literally their own sovereign nation that operates about a block in London and are just effectively used as another very sophisticated offshore tax haven. But the difference is that they have permanent residence in Westminster Abbey and actually, and therefore are extremely powerful at lobbying their own interests. So I don't know how much I've bastardized what they are, but could you give more clarity onto that?
Okay, so I think of the City of London as a state within a state. Geographically, it's 1 square mile, approximately 1 square mile, right at the heart of the capital of Britain. But they have their own separate government. They have their own separate police force. They have their own separate judiciary. In other words,
It's nuts.
They have representation in the form of a character called the Remembrancer. Now, just stop and reflect on that title, the Remembrancer, and the role of the Remembrancer.
Straight out of the Coronation.
Oh, boy. That's an interesting, symbolically, isn't it? It's very... Let me just give you a picture to, another anachronism of the Britain's multiple anachronisms to illustrate the separateness of that state. When the monarch rides as a result of an invitation is sent, come to the City of London, come to our Parliament in the Guildhall, which is where their own Parliament is set up. An invitation is sent, and the monarch will get into a gold coach with all their guards and so on, parade, and they'll come up to the frontier of the City of London. Now, you can visit that frontier because all the roads that lead into the city, into that square mile, have statues, sculptures of griffins on them, and that is their symbolic frontier, which delineates one state from the other. And when the monarch arrives at the frontier, symbolically, the coach stops. Well, the 4 horses stop. The guards stop. And then the City of London Guard takes over. And they're invited in to the separate state.
Yeah. You can see why so much great satire has come out of the English tradition.
Oh.
It's all just so ridiculous.
And on the one hand, tourists come from around the world to witness this absurdity.
I'm sure it looks good, to be fair.
I'd go
watch it
it's
tomorrow.
great.
If it
I
was
mean,
on.
who doesn't love red uniforms and horses and brass and this type of thing? It's it's great, and the endless tourists there. Oh, look, there's King Charles in a gold coach. But it's very symbolic, because what it's telling us is this is a different state. And the power of the remembrancer within Parliament, an unelected official who has a team of lawyers, and typically the remember is himself a lawyer, is to remind Parliament about the power of the City of London and the extent to which the government relies upon the banking world to buy up the bonds that they're issuing month by month at auction in London. This is, hey guys, you need us because we're going to be buying up the bonds which you rely on to finance your everyday operations.
And where's the income from the City of London come from to purchase those bonds?
Oh, and the City of London attracts deposits from all over the world. Of course, you have private wealth. It is probably still the largest offshore finance centre in the world, despite Brexit. Though I think that Brexit has massively harmed its many advantages. We'll talk about that separately. But it's still the largest offshore finance centre in the world. And it's got these satellites, tax havens like Jersey and Guernsey and Cayman and Bermuda and Gibraltar and Anguilla and British Virgin Islands, etc., that feed capital from all over the world. And I think despite all of the attempts to reduce money laundering and to impose sanctions on Russian capital and capital from all sorts of autocratic states, I think that capital is still flowing in vast quantities into London.
How do you explain that this City of London phenomena is, one, not more commonly known, but two, tolerated by the British people?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Tolerated by the British people. The British people have been told, in an era where Britain's development strategy, probably from the 1980s onwards, has failed to deliver key new industries, and Britain deindustrialised, lost out to car making and, you name it, aviation making and electronics and more recently telecoms and, basically Britain deindustrialised and failed to make up for it in other areas. And the British population have been told, hell, the City of London is the goose that lays the golden eggs. We cannot do anything about that. And it wasn't just the Tory governments that were saying that. Labour governments were saying exactly the same thing. And they've been kowtowing to the City of London for decades, fearful of the impact of, for example, pushing back against tax havens, blocking international attempts to regulate tax havens more effectively, tolerant of the fact that tax havens remain secrecy jurisdictions that don't publish the ownership of the shell companies set up in them. All of those things happen because successive British governments have been fearful of the impact on the economy of doing that. Now, my take on that is that that's the worst of all worlds to do, the worst of all development strategies, because far from being the goose that lays the golden egg, I think hosting the City of London as a major industry in Britain has undermined British development more widely. And if you bear with me, I'll unwrap that.
Yeah, no, that'd be good to know.
I'll unwrap that because, all that capital flowing through Britain, you'd have thought Britain would see massive investment.
Totally.
And there has been some investment in real estate. There's been some investment in football teams. You mentioned Manchester City. Well, look at Manchester United. Look at Newcastle United. You name it. They've been flogged off to people outside the country who are busy extracting wealth because these football clubs are generating huge income, and that income's going offshore.
And you mentioned it's in real estate. That's in the ownership of existing real estate rather than the construction of new real estate, which is a huge issue politically in this country at the moment.
It is, but I would say that there's also been a lot of investment in new real estate. Go to London. Anyone who knows London will know that some of the richest and most the costliest residential areas in London are empty.
Right.
They belong to investors from across the world who are just holding a flat or a house as an investment portfolio.
Something has to be done about that. And am I interrupting you right now? If I
No, you go ahead.
Okay, I think Australia is in an extremely similar position to London in the way that it manages investment properties. Luckily, Australia is so far away that the only people really coming to Australia to buy wealthy properties may be Chinese capital flight. But in London, you're the center of Europe, and you're an old nation, so you have really the who's who of wealthy will want to own something there, whereas Australia doesn't. So that's just a consequence of geography. But similar problem. If you manage to get to a point where you can own one property, then you can have extremely favorable conditions to negatively gear, own several other properties, and then rent them out to the market. And if you're renting them out, then it artificially raises the price of rent for everyone else so I think Sweden actually does something quite good here, which is that in Stockholm at least, you cannot own a property unless you live in it for more than X amount of days in a year. And it is such a significant amount of days that it wouldn't make sense that this would be like your summer home or something like this. And therefore what you have is, even though the price of property is still very high and in all the nice places still rich people will live, you nonetheless have the benefits of a community on the other side of that. Famously along Central Park in New York and so many places throughout London, the most valuable property in the city is literally empty. So what does that do to the foot walking traffic down below, to the shops that pop up all around? It's just tacky, high-end fashion and all the downstream flows of that. So anyway, the point I wanted to interject with was that I think Stockholm does something quite good on this. And I don't know what the other economic consequences of it are, but I'd like to hear what your reaction to that is.
Yeah, well, I think you've described the situation pretty much as I see it, with a little bit of a twist, which is London. You and I could go now, if we're just on the outskirts of London here, but we could go into London and we could look at entire blocks of luxury development. And if you go that night in the midwinter, you'll see very few lights on. And that's a giveaway. London has attracted oligarchs and plutocrats and kleptocrats in huge numbers and for a very long period.
It should be to the shame as well, I think, of the British people.
It is. I mean, it should be. And many British people are deeply embarrassed about this. I mean, how do we end up having so many kleptocrats, so many autocrats, and frankly, so many oligarchs from across the world who are, in many cases, just full-on criminals living in London, and pricing most people out of the London markets. And in many cases, they don't care about whether their flat is occupied for 10 days a week. 10 days a week. 10 days a year. Their kids would want to come here because, London's such a big playground and tolerates everybody and their kids. And I think a lot of people in Britain have huge misgivings about this, but the government, politicians have been extraordinarily tolerant. So you even have apparently, or supposedly, social democratic politicians saying, we don't care so much about whether people get very, very wealthy as long as they pay taxes. Now, the cynical part of that equation, and that's a Labour market position, that's a Labour Party position. The cynical part of that is they know damn well these people aren't paying taxes. Right. So basically what they're saying is, we don't care about people being super wealthy and moving to Britain and not paying taxes in the country where they normally live or made their wealth. And I think that's shockingly cynical. And I think it's fed into this deep skepticism, this huge political skepticism amongst the general public that basically our politicians are not acting in our national interest. And we can see that now. We're in the middle of an election. The Tory party is almost certainly going to disappear. But there's no enthusiasm for Labour because Labour is seen as not being that much in touch with the interests of the vast majority of people here. And I kind of agree.
What's your thoughts on Stockholm's property market?
I think it's good, but in practice, what will happen in London is that you'll find that in many cases these the families who own these properties are sufficiently extended that they'll send their kids here to university because they all want to learn English and get an English language degree, and then they'll be able to rotate it so the properties might well be operated. Properties might well be occupied to whatever threshold you set, and they game the system. And I think it'd be far better to entirely remove the non-domiciled rule, to introduce a land value tax which properly reflects the value of the properties.
Yeah, because it's not like that's going to be devastating to the British economy, right? Maybe the rationale is that therefore there wouldn't be this incentive for these extremely wealthy people to come and then use all of the other financial services which the city offers. But I'm just, from a purely, forget morality, but just purely from an economic point of view, why is that not a sound move?
I think, let me be straight up front, I think it would be a very sound move. And I want to unpack, or rather further develop my views about why hosting this vast city of London and this huge offshore economy is actually bad for the rest of the UK economy. Because for the greater part, all that capital flowing into and out of the city of London doesn't really touch the sides of the UK economy. They say the politicians use the mantra of attracting inward investment. But most of them, to be honest, are economically illiterate, and they don't understand what investment is. I make a big distinction between inward investment into new research, innovation, new products, new services, which is good. But the vast majority of the inward investment over the last 40 years has been into mergers and acquisitions, consolidating corporate power, creating massive monopolistic positions. And that is definitely not good for the UK economy. No. And what we've seen through the massive privatization programs over the last 40 years, we've arrived at that destination where it is manifestly harmful to the UK economy to have these huge inward investments into natural monopolies, whether it's water monopolies or rail monopolies or you name it, energy monopolies. The UK consumers are paying way over the odds compared to European Union consumers. We're not seeing the necessary investment in the infrastructure that's desperately needed, particularly in the water companies at the moment. And the UK consumer is not seeing the levels of innovation and investment in new infrastructure, in new productivity enhancements, in training and so on. Basically, capitalism has mutated into a rentier economy. In other words, rent-seeking, wealth-extracting investment. And the City of London is right at the core of that. That's what they're good at. That's what they do. They do mergers and acquisitions, and they create monopolies.
And economically, could you define rent-seeking?
In the Alice in Wonderland world of Economics 101, we work from the assumption of perfect competition. And
rational behavior.
And perfectly rational behavior, yeah. But I've only been a practicing journeyman economist for 45 years, so I haven't really had enough time to identify that many markets which are perfectly competitive. Yeah. What I've seen is plenty of markets that are oligopolistic, in other words, just a small number of big corporations competing in them. And in some cases, almost perfect monopolies. Now, I went on to do a lot of studying of imperfect competition, and I kind of recognized the beast, because the whole point about monopolies is once you have a monopoly, you're in a position where you can charge way above what would be the perfect market price, because you can extract whatever the hell you want. Think about.
No threat of competition.
No threat of competition. And for all the delusions of market economics, I think that describes the real world. I mean, I didn't study theoretical economics. I studied applied economics. Yeah, of course, alongside that, I studied some theoretical economics, but in applied economics, you look at the real world, not the fantasy world of a particular economic model. Um, and, and by the way, before I studied economics, I'd trained as an accountant in industry. Hey, do you want some more water?
No, go on, please.
So I'm wittering on here, but so before I studied economics, I actually worked in industry and trained as a cost and management accountant. So I had the insight of actually working in the real world in a very, very big company where the assumptions of perfect competition just didn't apply. We had a monopoly position and went to great lengths to protect that monopoly position with a whole range and a whole armory of things like copyrights, patents and licenses and frankly geographical market shares where we were just the dominant company and could charge way above what would be the market price in a competitive market. And that describes the real world. And I'm afraid that for the vast majority of politicians, they kind of think in terms of this abstracted perfect competition model, and they don't understand that when you have a monopoly, you're able to extract way above the normal market price, what would be the normal market price. And that's the difference between the market price in a perfectly competitive market and the market price in a monopoly-dominated market is described as rent.
Understood. And I know that you're, as you said to me earlier, doing a lot of work on monopolies these days alongside Nicholas Shaxson, former guest on the podcast, and we will get to that. But while you were speaking earlier, an anecdote came to mind, which I think you'll find particularly frustrating. I was interviewing Paul Cleary, who's an Australian journalist, and he wrote a book called $1 Trillion Baby. You know about it? Fantastic. Okay, so it's just for the audience at least, it's basically a history of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, how Norway first discovered and then extracted oil, but then crucially successfully managed it because so many countries before, the most common outcome was this Dutch disease or resource curse. And a detail which is just a throwaway line in the book, but stood out to me so much was that in the North Sea there, it was Aberdeen, Scotland, under the government of Margaret Thatcher, actually extracted just as much oil as Norway extracted. And if you look at the difference in the two outcomes of how that money was managed and spent, it is potentially one of the worst spread bets of all time, because the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund at this moment is, if not the biggest, certainly the top 3 biggest single asset managers in the world, with I think over $1 trillion USD under management. So just an insanely successful story of how a country had this huge natural resource windfall and then managed it globally to just secure pensions and whatever you want for generations down the line for the Norwegians. Whereas in the United Kingdom, it made a number of companies and a number of individuals extraordinarily wealthy, but did nothing to move the needle on whatever your sovereign wealth fund is in the United Kingdom. And the reason this anecdote came up is because you were talking about the state monopoly of water, rail, and energy. This wasn't quite a monopoly, but it does fall into that sort of just how on earth could this have happened?
You're touching on something which the vast majority of people are totally unaware of. North Sea oil and gas started pumping seriously in the 1970s before Margaret Thatcher. And the UK had put in place a tax regime which would have imposed royalties almost on the same level as the Norwegian royalties, which are very high indeed. And also had super taxes above the normal corporate income tax, which back in those days was over 50%. There was a super tax on supernormal profits. Yeah. So everything was in place for Britain to go down the Norwegian route and accumulate a massive sovereign wealth fund. And that was the promise that North Sea oil offered. So in the early 1970s, we had the OPEC oil crisis. Britain was massively impacted by that. British industry was massively impacted by that. But the way out of that was seen as North Sea oil offering the opportunity to accumulate a huge amount of capital that would be invested in rebuilding Britain's infrastructure. There was the promise in building a super high-tech economy. Mrs. Thatcher was elected in 1979, and amongst the first moves she took was to cut the corporate income tax, to cut the royalty base, to give the oil companies the huge concessions, huge tax reliefs on investment, and so on. In other words, a massive departure from the previous model. It's no coincidence that her husband was an oil industry executive. It's no coincidence that Mrs. Thatcher had no interest whatsoever in industrial capitalism. She was firmly aligned with the interests of finance capitalism, and she and most of her cabinet and most of her advisors aligned with the interests of finance capital rather than industrial capital. And I remember talking to Treasury people and people close to that government, and they very sneeringly talked about smokestack industries. We don't have a future in metal bashing, was the sneering term they used. In other words, we're going to abandon all of the existing industries. And we're going to strike out in the direction of new industries, and finance industry is going to be at the core of this. So the opportunity to build a sovereign wealth fund was blown away. Literally blown away. And as you say, a very small number of big companies, oil companies, yes, but also a small number of investors profited massively from this. Britain, it was a huge mistake, and by and large, the British people simply haven't thought it through. How the scale of that giveaway. And the scale of how that development strategy has failed. But what it did do was it exposed Britain to the dangers of the finance curse.
Well, maybe there could be a good documentary in it for you and the team to get around. You mentioned earlier how...
Whisper it quietly, but there might be a documentary in the pipeline.
Oh, I love the sound of that. I mean, I was shocked at how prolific you are in producing these pieces of media. You mentioned earlier 81, with 82, maybe 83 on the way. One of them, which from what I've seen at least, is the most well consumed, is a documentary called Spider's Web, which had a budget of £4,000. And when I last looked on YouTube, it had over 8 million views. And you mentioned that it further has potentially 50 million views in total because of distribution on a bunch of other different platforms around the world. You were a producer on that. So I would just love to hear you talk about your experience in, one, bringing that documentary together, but then as well, how surprised you were by the response that it got.
Right. Well, hats off to the director, Michael Oswald, who came to me. He said, look, I've read this book, Treasure Islands by Nick Shaxson. I know that you were very closely involved in working with Nick Shaxson on that book. I'd like to make a film which spins out of that book. And I said, yeah, great. And I worked with him very closely, identified a whole load of people who would be good for him. It's a bit of a talking heads documentary. I think it was the first documentary that seriously looked at the City of London in a slightly more critical light. But coming out of that, I tried to sell it to the BBC, and the BBC told me there's no interest at all in this kind of documentary, in this kind of subject, even after the financial crisis. There's no interest in this. And they said maximum audience for us would be about 10,000 viewers. Now, at the time, I was talking to a Chinese television, English language television stations, and they were very apologetic, and they said, John, we only have 10 million viewers for our films. And I thought, this is ridiculous, because, the British public really don't understand quite how the gravity, the extent to which the City of London has distorted the UK economy because of its political power, because of its proximity not just to Conservative governments but also to Labour governments, successive Labour governments. It's to the great shame of the Labour Party or Labour government of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown that the great financial crisis, which in many respects had its roots in London, actually occurred on their watch. Because I and many of my colleagues were telling them, the government, there is the mother and father of all crises building up, and it's going to really seriously impact on the UK economy. And they said, nonsense. The markets understand risk better than people like you do. And what's so astonishing about that arrogance and that stupidity is the markets, to their credit, were putting out signals saying, guys, you had better regulate us better, because this race to the bottom is undermining our business models. And in their stupidity and arrogance, the politicians ignored that. I mean, wow, what does one say about that? But anyway, the spider's web. The spider's web was a really good vehicle for going out there and campaigning for political reform at an international level, because I think it helped people understand something which they couldn't quite piece together. There was a jigsaw out there and they weren't seeing the full picture, and the spider's web was giving them a larger part of a bigger picture of how financial capital was undermining development. And I think that the follow-on, the sequel film on the finance curse, is going to take that a step further, but it's going to explore the extent to which financial capital is not... Most people think that the role of banks is to bring in deposits from all of us savers, or everyone who's lucky enough to have some savings. The banks will accumulate it and invest it into good things. Like hell, that's how the economy works. It just doesn't work like that. But that's the story, and it's a wonderful fiction which most people buy into. In fact, banks are licensed by the central banks to issue money. And they're incentivized to create money and put that money out in the economy. But most banks know that it's in their interests from the profit maximizing point of view to incentivize to lend money to mortgage takers and people investing in real estate and low risk stuff. Banks are really not particularly good at allocating capital into those new big emerging industries which are going to do exciting new things. They just don't do that. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, the transition away from fossil fuels has taken such a long time, because banks, by and large, have not been prepared to make the huge investments in the new renewable industry sectors on the scale that's needed. But anyway, by and large, the banks have been prepared to invest in mergers and acquisitions. They've been prepared to invest in real estate. They haven't been prepared to take the risks into the new emerging economy that we need to save the planet. And that's my bigger take.
And can we talk about the new sequel to it that you're producing?
Yeah, please do.
Nice. What's the focus going to be? And try not to scratch you.
I beg your pardon. Sorry about the trouser scratching. So, so the Finance Curse film comes out of partly out of my work in Jersey. What I saw when I was economic advisor in Jersey, my job description, line number one was to maintain a balanced and diversified economy, to advise on that. And this in the time in the 1980s and 1990s, when far from diversifying, Jersey was becoming a single sector offshore tax haven. End of story. Big banks, big accounting firms, big offshore trust companies, and the only reason they were there was because their clients wanted to avoid and evade tax and avoid and evade regulation. And so the City of London was happy to park all this stuff offshore in Jersey, because there was no risk of ever having a left of centre government which would change all of that. Wouldn't happen in Jersey. So what I saw was, again, far from helping the good people of Jersey, this was leading to incredible rates of inflation. The cost of living was astronomical. Young Jersey people couldn't afford housing. They couldn't afford rents. If they didn't work in the finance sector or in high-paid public sector jobs, they simply couldn't afford to live there, and they left. And other industries couldn't afford to live alongside this, or to profitably invest alongside this finance sector, because it was a cuckoo in the nest. It was making everything far too expensive. So no matter what I tried to do, talking to foreign companies interested in investing in tourism or horticulture or whatever, nothing would make economic sense or financial sense because the cost of operating there was too high. Only the banks, the big accounting firms, could operate there profitably.
Sorry to interrupt you there, but is it the pure just incentive of the potential return on this risk you're offering is so much more dangerous than this far safer bet, which we know and we're good at?
It was partly that, but there were other factors at play. And that was that as the finance sector became more increasingly dominant in the local economy, and the economy politically the island became more dependent on financial sector activity, more people employed in that area. That political dependence led to state capture. Now, bless them, the good politicians of Jersey are great at local level issues, but when it comes to international global capital, they are way out of their depth. Right. And that state capture became seriously dangerous for the rest of the world. And you can see that across the vast majority of tax havens, because the politicians simply didn't. They were only acting in the immediate interests of the finance industry in Jersey. They couldn't see the bigger picture, and that was propelling a race to the bottom. And the capital could use these places to undermine the regulation of other countries, and it's precisely what they did. So you had state capture, you also had judicial capture, so that they could shape the laws and then use the judiciary to interpret the laws in ways that were favourable to the big banks and to the accounting firms, again undermining the onshore regulations. And it just got deeper. So Jersey was a microcosm of what I could see happening in Britain and in other countries. And I gave it a name. The name was Finance Curse. Actually, it was Nick Shackton and I who concocted that name together, because Nick had been working on the resource curse for many years. Yeah. And it was his work in that area that kind of clicked. I was looking at oil and gas, but I was seeing exactly the same phenomena, including corruption, really high-level corruption, in the finance sector. So the name Finance Curse, which comes out of the term Finance Curse, the film we're working on, reflects not just my Jersey experience, but also what we saw happening in terms of the political power of the City of London and of Wall Street in the United States, and the gradual move away from the kind of post-war, I'm talking about World War II here, the post-war era, the golden era of industrial capitalism, which led on to households across the world being able to afford TVs, fridges, cars, foreign holidays. These were seen as the golden years of capitalism. But post-Thatcherism, Reaganism, that gradually transformed. I'm not going to say that it was a gradual process, but we moved from a productive economy, fridges, televisions, blah, blah, cars, etc., to an extractive economy where the wealth was flowing towards the big finance. And young people entering the labour market now can't afford houses, can't afford their rents, can't afford pensions, can't afford all the things that the post-war generation had. Yeah. And rightly, they're saying, well, this model of capitalism isn't working in our interests.
Regarding particularly the affordability question, undoubtedly all of this behavior and mechanisms that you've been working on your whole life and we've been speaking about in this podcast contribute to the unaffordable prices. But also, how much of it is just due to population growth and density, and just that at a certain point, the supply just can no longer meet the demand, and therefore it drives people to move elsewhere. You see this in all the major capital cities across the world. Mine in Sydney, yours in London, even Stockholm's experiencing it.
Sure. And there's no doubt, the UK economy has relied very heavily on inward immigration and also outward immigration. During the period when Britain was a member of the European Union, millions of young people moved to work in Europe and elsewhere. And broadly, it was a very positive thing. If we look now at the UK economy, partly because there's been so little investment in productivity improvement, it's tanked compared to other OECD economies, and that's because of a failure to invest in training. Lots of young people have had relatively good educations, gone on into to do degree courses, and I think all of that is very positive. But beyond that, but they're massively indebted by the time they leave universities. But alongside that, we haven't seen the necessary investments in training. So there's a deficit, whether it's unskilled labour to semi-skilled labour, whether it's construction sector or health workers. Britain is massively dependent upon migrant workers. And that's because of a failure to invest in the indigenous people here across the board. And whether it's engineering or whatever, Britain remains massively dependent upon migrant workers. So we shouldn't be pointing fingers at migrant workers. We should be pointing fingers at the failure to invest in training and improving productivity. But I think there's another factor, and that is that if you look over the last 40, 50 years or so, again, since the advent of Thatcherism and Reaganism, look at what's happened to earnings compared to prices.
Incomes, you mean?
Incomes.
It's shocking.
Yeah.
I have some stats on it later we can get to.
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up in an era when the average mortgage would be somewhere between 3.5 to 4 times the combined earnings of a household. In other words, my wife and I. Now it's massively higher, 7, 8, maybe 9, in some areas 10, 11, 12.
It's inconceivable that I'm 30, someone my age could own a property in Sydney or London if they didn't have significant help from their family.
Yeah, it's the bank grandmother. Bog. Without that, you simply couldn't, and you're being forced out. So a lot of young people are being forced out of living in the areas where they grew up. And that's not just tragic, it's enormously economically harmful. Right. And I think that London is one example, but I see it across many countries. And ultimately, it's a political failure because the banks have been incentivized, risk-free investment in property. The term bricks and mortars being, the safest investment. Well, the banks, by and large, have not been doing their job, which is to invest in improving productivity, in new products, in investing in new, companies doing exciting new things. They've been putting more and more money into real estate precisely because they know that people need it.
Right. Yeah, it's significantly less risky.
It's significant. There's no risk. There's no risk.
Yeah.
Because even when we here in Britain, I know it applies to Australia and to many other countries, even when there's a property market reduction, when the prices fall, guess what? The government steps in to prop the property prices up with one little gimmick or another, whether it's incentives for young people to buy in or cutting stamp duties or whatever. What they're doing is they're propping up the banks.
Interesting. I'm just wondering if there is anywhere deeper we could go on that particular point. I don't think I really understand why the banks their job would be to invest in productivity versus just wherever they can find the lowest risk ROI from a purely from a purely theoretical perspective, and why in practice it should be any difference. Does that question make sense?
It does make it a very good question, and it kind of gets to the heart of my critique of the current or the contemporary political economy, because by and large, investing in big issues, in big research and development, there was a time when the state took on a lot of those investments, and we had a mixed economy where you would have the state directing capital into research and development, into training enhancement, into this, that, and the other. Thatcher, amongst other things, simply abolished all the industrial training boards in this country. Well, guess what? 40 years later, we have a dearth of trained, across the board, trained engineers, trained health workers, trained education workers, you name it. Britain is short of this. And I think it's rooted in the fact that we didn't take a strategic long-term view of this. Yeah, a capitalist bank, of course, its interest in a shareholder economy or shareholder capitalism is entirely directed towards maximizing returns to shareholders. It used not to be the case. They had a wider stakeholder perspective. Shareholder capitalism is very different to the previous model of capitalism. And that evolution, I think, has been transformative at many, many levels. But it also means that banks have no interest in the long run. I've got a personal anecdote about that one, which I give. So I've been a motorcyclist since the age of 15. And I grew up with Nortons and BSAs and Triumphs and this, that, and the other. English brands. Not because I'm totally chauvinist, but because English brands were amongst the most exciting ones available. If you go into the plant room next door in my garage, there's a brand new BSA, made in India. But that's nothing to do with my story. Right at the beginning of my career,
just a lamentation.
Work with me on the anecdote, because as it happens, the chairman of BSA in the 1950s and 60s was a friend of my dad's. And they used to drink together in the same drinking team in Jersey at a time when the big story, the narrative around British industrial capitalism was it's all the fault of trade unions, intransigent trade unions. And the chairman of BSA, which was the biggest engineering combine in Britain at the time, by the way, British BSA stands for either bloody sore ass if you're a motorcyclist, or for Birmingham Small Arms, and they were a conglomerate making everything from heat pumps through to motorcycles to cars and all sorts of things. Weapons, many people had BSA rifles, but they also made artillery, all sorts of things. If you watch Peaky Blinders, it begins with the BSA.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
But the chairman of BSA said, this is absolute nonsense. I don't really have that much of a problem with the trade unions. My problem was with the banks. And when I went to visit BSA at age 19, because I was interested in writing an article about it, and saw the pitiful amount of investment in new plant and in research and development, it was an eye-opener. I was shocked by what I saw. And I talked to the engineers, and they were perfectly good engineers, but we're working on designs which came up in the 1930s. And I went straight from Birmingham to Munich to talk to the board and the senior development team at BMW. And it was a complete shock because they were about to introduce a new range to the market. And they had over 450 research and development people in their team. BSA had 2 working on their new model, 2. And they had state-of-the-art stuff and state-of-the-art equipment. And I said, well, what's the difference? What do you think is behind the collapse of the British motorcycle industry, which was in the state of collapse? And they said, it's quite simple. Our bank has been on our board since 1912. They understand how long it takes to invest in a new model, at least 7 years from concept through to production and to market. 7 years, typical cycle. And they work with us. and the British banks have no such interest. They want returns within a 3-year cycle. And there you have the finance curse encapsulated on 2 wheels.
What,
Yeah.
so then what was the difference with the German banks? Why did they have more of an appetite for risk? Just because the economy was in a completely different position?
Great question. A great question. First of all, they don't have the City of London. They do now in Frankfurt. But the German banking model was based, their bank was a so-called Raiffeisen bank. And that's more like a mutual or cooperative bank, which operates at local level in Bavaria and takes in deposits from savers across the region and directs those profits, directs those savings to local industry. So it's essentially a cooperative bank taking accumulating capital from local savers and putting it into local businesses and local industry. Great model, perfectly profitable in the long run, but that's as a mutual organisation, that's their objective, and their objective was not and is not to maximise returns to shareholders.
So it's just show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome all the way down. Okay.
Yeah. Again, for me, it's bad economics because somehow in this model of capitalism of the Anglo-Saxon world, we've assumed that the banks are going to be the allocators of capital par excellence. They can always do a better job of it than mutuals or state-run organizations. And we've geared all the incentives towards that kind of banking model. And that banking model is very short-termist and strangely risk-averse.
Right.
And detached from the real economy, oddly enough.
It's a pretty impossible problem, isn't it?
No, hell no. It could be solved. I'm a political economist. It could be solved instantly by taking away all the absurd incentives that we've given. Right from.
But this requires immense political courage.
It requires a change of political thinking, and at the moment, I don't see that on the horizon, either here in Britain or in Australia, to be frank, or in many other countries. I mean, there are some countries where you have a more developed venture capitalists, but infrastructure, but venture capitalists expect extraordinary returns and pretty short term as well. Private equity they're just pure wealth extractors.
Yeah, that's rent seeking.
That's the worst example of rent seeking. You talk to some people within the Labour Party, and they recognise that the state needs to play a greater role in getting things started, particularly in the renewable side. That this transition from the kind of oil and gas dominated fossil fuel industry to a renewable industry requires a huge amount of state investment to get the infrastructure in place, at which point private capital will invest.
Yeah, at which point it's significantly lower risk to redesign your entire fleet of cars or whatever else.
Yeah. I mean, economists like Mariana Mazzucato have been ploughing that furrow very successfully, and I totally agree with that route. We need a more enterprising state, which will work in tandem with private capital to create the conditions in which private capital don't have to carry the extraordinary risks of that transition.
Yes. I can give you a really... I don't know how really nice it is, but a pretty nice example in Sweden at the moment. There's a company called Northvolt, if you're familiar with them. Yeah, I'm familiar with them. Great. So, they can, the government has invested, I don't know the amount of money, but extraordinarily high amounts of money in attracting all the best labor around the world. They have thousands of employees. They're in a very remote part of Sweden next to a series of hydro dams. So their cost of energy is extremely low. And they're producing really as high end of the market as possible green batteries. And it's a great example of the state being the ones who can take the very long-term risk versus private capital, which, if you're offering returns to the grandchildren, it's just less appealing.
Exactly. I think that's a great example of how a successful mixed economy could work, and how the need for the state to take on that really big risk, both in research and development, and then helping private capital move towards production. And that requires vast armies of skilled workers, etc., etc., etc. Now, we just haven't seen that in Britain, and Britain has completely missed out on the battery market as a result.
Oh, you had one which went bankrupt. What was it called?
Britvolt.
Yes.
And it just didn't take off because the government didn't successfully help work with the partners. Yeah, they chucked a lot of subsidy in that direction, but they didn't make all the necessary steps to help it work, including, by the way, encouraging migrant workers, the really high-skilled scientists and so on.
Oh, well.
So, they just tripped it up at every level.
Yeah, the most public self-inflicted wound of all time. I mean, Brexit.
That's Brexit.
Just
hey guys, let's shoot ourselves in one foot, and once we've done that, why not shoot ourselves in the other foot?
Yeah, and then lose your hands while you're at it.
Yeah.
Just like it's. I haven't met anyone who. I don't know if I knew anyone who ever was super pro Brexit. At least my very conservative mate back in Australia, but he's so separated from it, so it doesn't count as much. But I couldn't imagine how still you're sitting around thinking Brexit was a terrific idea. You don't have to explain why. It's more just a comment. But
but I do want to comment back on that one, because I get why so many people were so unhappy with so many things in this country. A large part of the Brexit vote seemed to me to be some kind of post-imperial reaction to the fact that Britain was just losing out at every single level. And young people weren't getting the opportunities, and their grandparents were saying, hey, why are you not enjoying the same opportunities that we had? And it was easy, very easy for populist politicians to say it's about immigrants, or it's about Europe and regulations and this, that, and the other.
It's about Europe.
Like hell it was. But one of my neighbours, who I dearly love, very friendly at many levels, a retired engineer, and he said, I've always hated the metric system, and I want to go back to Whitworth spanners because I've got a full set of Whitworth spanners. And I said, seriously? He said, yes, because we need to take back control at every level. Yeah. I go back to Whitworth spanners. Listeners, I ask you, have you ever seen or used a Whitworth spanner?
I've never heard of Whitworth to begin with.
Well, let me tell you that I had a Norton motorcycle. It all revolves around motorcycles. Of course, what else could? Which had four different types of gauges. Yes, it had metric. It had Whitworth. It had BSF. And it had AF. Whoever's heard of these things? And somehow deep in the psyche of many people was this sense that it's not a good thing to just have a metric system across the world. Well, listeners, it is a good thing.
Of course it's a good thing.
It's a very good thing, because that level of standardization meant that manufacturers could produce things which would work everywhere in the world to a certain standard. And it was a very good thing indeed. And in reversing out of that, we've exposed ourselves to potentially disastrous consequences. And I want to unpack that, because I'm going to link it back away from motorcycles, sorry about that, folks, to the City of London. Because some of the key drivers, this won't surprise anyone, I think, some of the key drivers behind Brexit, the big money sitting behind it, came out of the more speculative end of the City of London. Not the serious banks and the accounting firms. No, folks, this was the private equity people and the hedge funds and this, that, and the other, who were actually concerned about European Union moves to push back against tax avoidance. And the European Union trying to arrive at a regulatory framework which would protect consumers from the great financial crisis. And their vision of post-Brexit City of London would be a City of London that would deregulate, the so-called Singapore-on-Thames model.
Yeah.
And that Singapore-on-Thames model, which was pushed by Prime Minister Theresa May and her Chancellor Philip Hammond, would have involved massive deregulation to reclaim London's role as the global tax haven. And that was very dangerous.
Also not necessary. Singapore is a swamp coming out of disastrous economic conditions with no economic opportunities. For them, the incentive to, create wealth and some type of security via incentivizing the offshore business to knock on their door is a little bit more understandable than an island with so many other economic opportunities at its doorstep. Why is it? I don't even see why it's compelling. If you could deliver the Singapore on the Thames model, it's so unnecessary. Britain has so many other things
exactly.
going for it.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Susan Strange, I mentioned Professor Susan Strange. She always raised the most important question in political economics, and particularly in international political economics. And that question, readers brush up on your Latin, is cui bono? Who benefits? Who benefits from this? Who benefits from Singapore and the Thames? And it's quite clearly only a very small number of hedgies, private equity investors, and so on. The rest of the British population wouldn't benefit from it one little bit. No. Quite the opposite. It would be totally detrimental to it. But worse, the Singapore, what the serious manufacturers in Britain and serious bankers who had a very large market share in Europe wanted was to be inside the customs union and inside the single market. And to stay inside the single market, in order to retain that market, they had to stick with what's technically called equivalence of regulation. That's the term that's used in financial services, which meant they couldn't deviate from the European regulations. And they were reasonably happy with that. I spoke to a lot of the leading bankers at the time, and they said, we see no advantage, we see nothing but disadvantage. But above all, don't deviate, because then we lose. If we deviate from it, we lose our ability to trade in services within banking services, that is, within the European Union model. The hedgies weren't interested in that in the slightest. That wasn't there. But the danger of having the world's biggest financial capital deviate away from good regulation and so on is that they would undermine the regulation of other countries and promote a race to the bottom. And that's the danger of having a free-booting, free market, offshore financial capital.
So we've been talking for about an hour and 40 minutes. There are a few more things I want to bring up with you.
Sorry, I probably whittled on too much. But
especially because of Jim Henry's Blood Bankers. Something that book really brings home is just the idea that everything we've been speaking about is obviously a negative consequence of the offshore plumbing and behavior that allows. But as well, it enables criminal organizations to scale to the heights that they do. It probably is the single biggest lever they can pull in terms of maintaining their anonymity, whilst also having access to huge pools of capital, which they can then pay very large amounts of people to do bad things, keep them loyal, but then as well to buy lots of weapons, drugs at huge amounts of time, or, everything else. So that's a huge part. But as well, how it hinders economic development within the developing world. So there are two massive branches from which you can swing. Please decide which you would like to do.
Wow. So look, let's raise it to the level of international political economics to begin with, and go back to the global model of globalization that was pursued from the 1980s onwards. Because you talked about, the way in which the international financial markets became criminalized, and none of that should be a surprise to anybody, because when you have offshore secrecy, when you have these tax havens that don't disclose the ownership of shell companies and who's behind the offshore trusts, when you enable capital, whether it's accumulated by drug barons or by kleptocrats in mineral-rich African countries, or former Soviet Union countries or wherever, when you enable capital to roam freely and in a secretive sort of way, you create what social scientists call a criminogenic economy, an economy where it is more profitable to invest in criminal activities than in activities which most people in society would regard as productive and socially useful. We handed the global economy over to kleptocrats and oligarchs and this, that, and the other, particularly in African countries. We in Britain and in the United States and in other leading economies said, hell yeah, you can steal from mineral-rich or oil and gas-rich countries, and we'll look after the money. We'll hide it through British Virgin Island companies, and that is the political.
Completely immoral.
Oh, not only immoral, it was destructive not only for the Angolas and the Nigerias and the Libyas of this world, it was harmful to our own economies. Basically, we were wrecking the global economy in doing this. And that's where the finance curse comes in, because the politicians here thought, this is great, all that Russian money flowing in, all that Nigerian oil and gas revenue, all those Angolan oil and gas revenues, you name it, this is fantastic. But it wasn't coming in here and investing in genuinely new entrepreneurial activities. It was rent-seeking in its activities. So it wasn't helping the economy here. It certainly wasn't helping the economies in Angola or Nigeria or elsewhere. Quite the opposite. It was destabilizing. And it wasn't just destabilizing economically, it was destabilizing politically. We were creating the kind of divided, increasingly autocratic, plutocratic world that describes the 2020s. And we were actively doing this in the name of free market globalization. And I don't think any of the economists at that time in the 1980s foresaw that that was the end destination. And the politicians, frankly, were by and large clueless about this. A huge amount of the blame must be attached to them because they took decisions at the time which they must have known would be harmful to the developing countries, but also to their own country.
I'd like to give you an example of a series of kleptocrats at the moment, which you might not know exactly how they are operating, but just use them as an example to explain how these kleptocrats are using the offshore plumbing to make it happen. So the three leaders of Hamas have between them $8 billion in assets, or I don't know if assets is the right terminology, but nonetheless in wealth, and they live in Qatar. So please explain how that's possible and where the offshore economic system is allowing that.
Okay, so the offshore system is not just a number of geographical jurisdictions or political jurisdictions, tax havens like Switzerland or Luxembourg or Delaware or Jersey or City of London. It's also a vast infrastructure of accountants, of lawyers, of bankers, obviously, real estate, realtors, and so on. It's a vast infrastructure. We call it the pinstripe infrastructure of enablers and facilitators of money laundering. And for all the great work of the Financial Action Task Force, they've achieved diddly squat in decades. I mean, they really haven't pushed back against that infrastructure of lawyers, accountants, and other professionals who make their livelihoods from enabling illicit financial flows. And ideologically, in many cases, they're committed to the idea that those illicit financial flows will actually be beneficial. No, they're not. They've led to squandering on a planetary scale on private jets and luxury goods of one kind or another. They certainly haven't led to the so-called developmental flows of capital into the global south. It just hasn't happened.
The outcome of government aid here.
Not just government aid. I'm talking about kleptocracy, where these either the leaders of oil states or mineral states or you name it, where huge amounts of rents can be extracted either from the ground or from some kind of extractive process. The notional idea is that money would be reinvested in the domestic economy, like hell it was, enabled by all these armies of lawyers and offshore tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions. That money has disappeared offshore, and it's ended up being invested in real estate, whether it's in the south of France, or the city of London, or in Miami. That's been partly where it's ended up. Always been invested in English football clubs, or in mergers and acquisitions. What it hasn't done is it hasn't been invested in developing the industries in the countries where that wealth was extracted. And that's led to political instability, it's led to impoverishment, it's led to rising inequality, it's led to a huge disillusionment in the very notion of democracy.
And I was listening to a lecture that Rory Stewart gave on economic development, I think at Yale, on the train ride over here. This is a guy who, by the way, I only learnt his name 2 days ago. And I've fallen in the deep end. I think it's just a remarkable person for so many reasons. I'm reading his book in between places, walking across Afghanistan, and I'll eventually maybe get to his political stuff. But anyway, it sounds like the point you're making, and this is why I bring up Rory now, is that not only has this huge amount of money that's being given via aid and other means to the developing world been a neutral outcome, but rather actually a net negative outcome. So specifically from the perspective of economic development, where does offshore come into this? Sorry for such a vague question, but anyway.
Okay. But it is a really interesting question. And I want to begin with a conversation I had decades ago with the head of tax at the OECD. The OECD, interestingly, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has been a very key rule setter, even though it's notionally just a think tank for the industrialized countries. It has largely set the rules in key areas, including taxation of multinational companies. So I was sitting having drinks late one night with the head of tax, a very clever person. Anyone who works in tax is going to be very knowledgeable, and he really understood this area. And he said, look, we've got to move to an era where aid is spelt differently. It's spelt TAX. Because if you really want to help developing countries move away from aid dependency, with all the political kind of controls that are attached to aid flows, he said, we need to put them into a position where they can tax their capital. Mm-hmm. But if their capital has moved offshore, and if the multinational companies that are busy extracting their oil and gas can't be taxed effectively, then they're going to remain aid dependent rather than move towards tax. And in all cases, tax is a more democratic way of raising the money. It's democratic because when you start taxing people, they have skin in the game. They're going to put pressure on the politicians to spend that money more wisely on education or better infrastructure or blah, blah, blah. When politicians can extract wealth from oil and gas directly and then put that money offshore, and I'm not just thinking about Angola, it's been a global phenomenon, I'm afraid.
Yeah, from Nick Shaxson's book, there was, from one of the former French colonies in Africa, this political leader's son, who was a pretty nasty bloke, was not only living in Paris, but had such an extravagant apartment in Paris that he had several cars in his apartment at the top floor of a building. This is from one of the poorest countries on the planet.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've had similar experience. At one stage, I was quite closely involved through the London School of Economics in trying to educate Saif al-Islam Gaddafi. Gaddafi's at that stage chosen successor, and he lived in London in not one London house in an expensive place, but two London houses that have been knocked together with a huge, and it was a fascinating insight into, just what a different world these people operate. But I don't want to make too big an issue of that one. But yes, the problem is that these kleptocrats can't really extract their wealth and then safely hold it. Because as Gaddafi himself demonstrated, at some stage the people are going to come and they're going to kill you. So he needed to get his wealth offshore, and they all need to get their wealth offshore. And that requires a huge infrastructure of compliant Western banks and lawyers and accountants and fund managers and realtors. And they've all bent over backwards, particularly here in London, to support this kind of process. And in doing that, to undermine the move towards more democratic states where politicians are accountable, not just for raising taxes, but for spending the money wisely within their countries. So we've created the worst of all conditions. We've supported the kleptocrats, undermined democracy, undermined development. And then we come through and say, hey, look how good we are. We're giving you all this overseas aid. You should be grateful. I don't think so. I think if we want to move towards more self-reliance, then we need to reset the rules for taxation of capital so developing countries can effectively tax the profits of companies making profits in their countries and can effectively block their kleptocrats from stealing on an industrial scale and shifting the country's wealth offshore.
Can you explain what you just said through an example, whether real or made up? But I don't think I fully understand that difference you're making between recalling it aid to tax, and why once I'm being taxed, I have more skin in the game to incentivize the politician. Just if you could, if you have on top of mind, just
so
bring it home
let's
with an example.
start with a kind of a slogan. It's no more than, I'm not going to pronounce anything more profound than a slogan, which is that tax is the lifeblood of democracy. We pay our taxes in the expectation that politicians will, raise that money through taxation, ideally as fairly as possible, and then spend that money on our behalf into education and security, justice, health systems, infrastructure, working towards creating the kind of modern economy where private sector investors will see the right conditions to profitably invest. That's the way a modern economy should work. Now put yourself into the situation of Libya in the 1990s and the noughties, where, there was a dictator, a guide, prophet, call him what you will, who was in control of this, who had set up all sorts of offshore foundations which were milking all the oil revenues and shifting them offshore, massive personal investments through these offshore trusts and foundations in real estate here and football teams there. Remember, they at one stage owned AC Milan, I think it was.
I didn't know.
And so on. And oddly, that was one of the better case scenarios, but it wasn't developing a sustainable political economy in Libya.
So what would the alternative
It was looting. The alternative would be the kind of a more Norwegian-based model where all those oil and gas revenues would actually be, the term that's used is sterilized.
But that requires effective governance within Libya.
Absolutely.
I more mean when the United Kingdom has its £20 billion purse of foreign aid. How would that be deployed differently?
Well, I mean, to its credit, the UK government used to have quite effective international assistance. I beg your pardon. Okay, let's start again. So, it's money irritating the shit out of me. It's digging into me. Get that out of the way. Filthy lucre. So, I mean, there are two types of aid. There's developmental aid and humanitarian assistance. And, when there's a disaster, all countries that can afford it should step in if it's an earthquake or a flood or something which has a humanitarian aspect. We all rightly should step in and help. development assistance is longer term in its approach, and it should be aiming to help countries reach a level of development where they become self-reliant. And at the point they become self-reliant, they have two choices. They can continue, in many cases, as they have done, to raise debt on the international capital markets, to be reliant upon rising external loans, either from private banks or the International Monetary Fund, or they could move towards a more sustainable tax system, which would enable them to raise a larger proportion of their governmental spending from domestic taxation and invest that into education and infrastructure, research and development and health, and all those good things, the move towards a modern state. Increasing, if you look at the last 40, 50 years, increasing reliance upon external debt with all the volatility that creates and the rooms for profiteering and, becoming debt dependent, all of which I think most people would accept are bad things. We've seen some progress towards enabling countries in the global south to tax multinational companies, but it's limited. And by and large, the wealthy elites of these countries, and some countries, think India, they have huge numbers of billionaires, and those huge numbers of billionaires are paying very little tax. So they've got a very regressive tax system. And they're not delivering in terms of education for the impoverished people. They're not delivering the health systems, so they've got the worst of all worlds. They've got an increasingly unequal economy and society with an awful lot of people, a large kind of emerging upper middle class who are getting spectacularly rich, and a very large Daljet class.
I don't know.
It's
The Indian word for class, you mean?
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
caste. Huge number of very low-income households who remain massively impoverished.
Yeah.
And I've seen similar things in Africa, similar things in Latin America. But the goal should be to move beyond being dependent upon development aid and huge external loans to mobilizing domestic capital and getting that domestic capital invested into the local economy. Well, that doesn't happen when offshore enables the kleptocrats and oligarchs to short-circuit the process and shift their capital surreptitiously and criminally into the offshore tax havens. Yeah. That's the kind of the criminogenic part.
And it's all enabled through the secrecy mechanisms above all.
Yeah. I mean, anecdotally, I'll give you an example from my experience of working offshore in an offshore trust company in Jersey. One of the companies I was administrating had a single-purpose role. It was serving an upstream oil and gas venture in Nigeria. Monthly, we issued an invoice for unspecified engineering services. And the invoice might be anywhere between $750,000 to $2 million.
Wow.
This is monthly, year in, year out. And this is quite a long time ago. That money was paid by the operating company in Nigeria, routed through a trust company, the bank of a trust company in Bermuda, and paid on our instruction to shell companies set up in the British Virgin Islands. Mm-hmm. Who was behind those shell companies in the British Virgin Islands? Almost certainly National Oil Company, NOC, officials and politicians. That's the way that the money, Nigerian oil and gas, was disappearing offshore.
That's a fantastic example.
It couldn't possibly happen without that offshore trust company in Jersey, banks in Switzerland, a trust company in Bermuda, a whole bunch of shell companies in the British Virgin Islands, and all the officials, whether they're accountants or lawyers, who act as intermediaries along that process.
To the point where after they pay their services and fees to all these intermediaries, they can take out their American Express and travel the world, buy jewelry.
Trust me, the fees that were being charged, that we were charging, were extortionate.
Right.
And they were only extortionate because we knew, and the clients knew,
Yeah.
that these were criminal flows.
Interesting.
So it's the most unholy alliance between professionals and criminals.
It is.
There's no other term for it.
Yeah, my God.
And that's what I mean when I talk about a criminogenic environment.
Yeah.
It's incredibly profitable.
This strikes me as Javier Milei, who is a pure liberal, at least what he says to the world. Would this fall into his economic worldview as a market operating efficiently? Or do you think even this type of stuff, he would say, you know, that's pure extortion. We can regulate against that. I know you don't know the man, but
I don't know the man, but I've spoken with many kind of extreme market libertarians.
Yeah.
And I have to say that Jersey had its own fair share of the extreme market libertarians.
You got to morally justify it one way or another.
And they don't even bother. They just say the markets always know best. There should never be Milton Friedman's position was always.
If Milton had seen that example you just gave, though, I couldn't imagine him turning around and saying, "Look, that's just the market finding a fair price."
Well, he always equivocates around this because he says as long as they're operating within the rule of the law. And that was equivocal because in many respects, the laws of British Virgin Islands are rigged to ensure that secrecy is protected.
Yeah, you still had to classify it as extraordinary engineering work, not
absolutely
not deposit to X, Y, and Z.
I don't know where Milton Friedman would have stood on this. I've discussed with quite a number of his acolytes in Washington at Cato Institute and so on, as they set up their own little think tank called the Center for Freedom and Prosperity to counter my work at Tax Justice Network. It was unbelievable. And I used to go and debate with these guys, and they would just say, "You're a communist." Any state intervention to try to regulate that would just lead to unseen consequences, which would lead to it would undermine the free freedom of the markets to allocate capital efficiently.
Really?
But my response to that was always, efficiently for who? Because the word efficiency is a very slippery word. And I don't like it because efficiency, going back to Susan Strange's cui bono, who benefits? Efficiency for one person might be criminal activity for another.
Right. And also, because when Smith was writing, the idea of very hyper-specialized labor and everyone acting in their own self-interest in a small little community probably created a much fairer market than someone who didn't know any of them allocating them money and allocating them goods. But as we have these insane efficiencies of transport, whole regions of countries having hyper-specified labor, that has to change the calculus for someone like Javier Milei, who's an archetypal figure for this worldview.
Yeah. That just you throw up so many questions, and they really get to the heart of the issues here. So how long have we got? I'd begin by saying, of course, Smith was writing in response to his contempt for the East India Company, a chartered monopoly. And he looked at this monopoly and said, look at the damage this is doing. Yes, it might be efficient at one level in raising astonishing amounts of capital accumulation for the landed gentry, but look at what it's doing. And he was horrified by this. He was a moral philosopher at heart. But he couldn't possibly have envisaged the extent to which the global economy would become dominated by hyper-concentrated capital, multinational companies which have global control over entire sectors. And I'm not just thinking about the Microsofts or the Amazons or that of the world. You can look at, even down to the level of aggregates where you have some key players and who dominate cement and concrete and aggregates sectors in entire continents, or a global monopoly covering all spectacles, all glasses and all sunglasses, falling into the kind of orbit of a single Italian-owned monopoly. You name it, it's there. He couldn't possibly have envisaged that. But he warned against it. He warned against the dangers of these kind of concentrations. And I think he also warned against the dangers of the political power that flows from it. Now, one of my criticisms of economics generally is that it never addressed the extent to which power shapes markets. Yeah, there were economists like Joan Robinson and others who looked at imperfect markets, and Susan Strange, who sought to bring the issue of power into it. But I think what's becoming increasingly obvious to people across the world is that some of these companies have become more powerful than states, the states they elect.
Absolutely.
And these companies are accountable to nobody apart from their shareholders.
Yeah, barely so.
Barely so, yeah. Okay, in some cases they're accountable just to one person.
Right.
That is really scary, and not in anybody's interests apart from this tiny minority who control that power. It has undermined democracy. It has led to Trump. It has led to Nigel Farage in this country. It has led to massive disillusionment, and we now need, as economists, to be more cognizant of how economic power is undermining democracy.
Yeah.
That is the core of the film we're working on, the Finance
I
Girls
absolutely
film.
love that.
And it's the core of so much of my thinking, because going back to my childhood and my interest in my concerns about fascism, I think fascism emerges out of bad economics, particularly bad macroeconomics.
I just want to bring up Rory Stewart again because he's on my mind, and I tried teeing up the question of economic development from me listening to a lecture he gave on it. I know he's a conservative, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are of him and whether you think he actually would have made for a very serious, extremely well-informed leader who would be able to, at least from my sense, be able to have quite a serious discussion on all of these extremely difficult topics and hold his own.
Over the course of my lifetime, I've watched the Tory party disintegrate, particularly in the last 15 years. We're here in Britain. We're still kind of coming back to the surface after the experience of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, Theresa May as Prime Minister, Truss as a Prime Minister for about the lifetime of a lettuce, and now Sunak. So we're in a state of shock about what is conservatism. We don't really know, but I remember when there were serious players in the Conservative Party here in Britain and elsewhere who were genuinely engaged in wider discussions. It is, for me, it's fantastically refreshing to have someone like Rory Stewart coming from a conservative position, clearly interested in the importance of discussion, of trying to understand the way the world is reshaping, and it's reshaping very fast. And I think that he is genuinely intellectually open from a conservative point of view. I won't pretend for a second that I come from that worldview, but it is incredibly important that we have serious people coming from that worldview. Hats off to Rory Stewart. I think it's fantastic. And I'd love to think that after an election where I think the Conservative Party is going to be consigned to oblivion, a new party will emerge with serious thinkers like Rory Stewart at the helm, because we really need them. I totally, I welcome the fact that he is engaging in a debate, because we haven't had any serious conservative thinking for a very long time, whether it's the Republican Party in the US or the Conservative Party in Canada or in Australia, or some of the Conservative parties, the Christian Democratic Party or in Germany, or the centre-right parties in France, many of which have simply disappeared, alongside the centre-left parties in France and Germany, leaving a space open for hard left kind of revanchist parties still thinking back to the glory days of the 1970s in Germany and arguably elsewhere, or captive left parties like the Democrat Party in the United States. We really need to have politicians who can engage in some serious discussion about the nature of a political economy for the 21st century. And I don't see it anywhere.
No. Have you ever had any interactions with Rory?
Not personally, no.
Do you think that he's engaged with your work somewhere along the line?
That'd be a good question. Because I think he actually believes in reading books and listening to, serious programs. I think very likely he would be. And I think it's more than possible that if Rory Stewart and I sat down in a room, or we sat down with some people who are seriously wanting to engage in a discussion, he would be a fascinating interlocutor. I would love it.
I have just had an ambition to maybe host like a podcast between the two of you, just as an excuse to get
Bring
in
it
the
on.
same room.
Bring it
I
on.
think that'd be fantastic.
At a personal level, I respect the man enormously, even though he voted for austerity. He has a poor track record. And he would probably argue that that's because politics these days whips the politicians into doing things which they don't mean to do. They don't really want to. I don't want to put words in his in his mouth, but I've heard that from many other serious conservative politicians who have either been in the cabinet since 2010 or whatever, and they say, to be honest, we've often found ourselves in a position where we're voting against our consciences. And I think that's a big problem with modern politics. And also, changing tack here, but bear with me on this one. I spend a lot of time talking to some of the most senior people in the accounting world and in the legal world. I actually had a research program going for a while to talk about, I was writing a chapter for a book about what was the title? The title was The Moral Economy of Neoliberalism and Fraud. And in my chapter, I looked at the way in which legal professionals and accounting professionals and banking professionals could square their personal values with the kind of work they're doing. These are amongst the most intelligent, educated and trained people on the planet. And they're prepared to engage in working with kleptocrats and helping kleptocrats to loot their countries. I said, how could this possibly be the case? And they say, because we work within a system where we no longer act as professionals guided by our personal values and our consciousness. We have to work within a framework which requires us to do this, because that's where we maximize profits for our companies. As professionals, your role is to bring your values into the process. And I say, we can't do this. And I've heard the same from ministers in this government and in other countries. We cannot vote if we cannot vote within the framework of our own values, even when we know it's against our values and against the interests of our country, because we are bound by party whipping processes.
Yeah. It's, I don't know, institutional capture, but at a political level. But we could go on for a lot more, I'm sure, but I'm also conscious of the audience. I don't want to take advantage of their time.
I'm assuming that you're going to be cutting much of this, so that's
no,
okay.
I don't think I will, but nonetheless, I've got one more prepared question for you, and then two that I try to ask every guest. So only, depending on how terse you are with the response, only about 20 minutes left. I want to read you some statistics from Sweden. You opened up the podcast by saying that you're seeing this across all of Europe, this sort of how the finance curse is deteriorating democracies. And so the Swedish facade is that of phenomenal economy, great welfare state, super high standard of living, And all that is true. However, there was a book recently written by Swedish journalist Andreas Cervenka. It's called Gidersferia. It hasn't been translated into English yet, unfortunately. But here are some of the high-level stats which he uncovered. He's an economic journalist. Over the last 10 years, Sweden has seen a significant tax-deductible mortgage interest, the abolition of Sweden's property tax, no inheritance tax, nor tax on gifts. Swedes' debt has grown from 90% of their total income in 1996 to over 200% in 2021, making the population one of the most indebted in the world. Swedish company debt has also shot up from 107 to 179. And if you add up debt owned by individuals, by companies, and by the public sector, it comes out to over 300% of GDP, which is more than Spain, Italy, and the UK, and the US. Sweden has the biggest gap between the highest marginal tax on labor and the highest tax on capital of any country in the OECD. So in other words, nowhere else is it harder to get rich through your salary. Sweden's billionaires own 16% of Sweden's national wealth, double the share they had in 2016, and quadruple what they had in 1996. The wealth of Sweden's billionaires amounted to 68% of GDP. The richest 0.1% of Swedes hold 29% of total household wealth, and Sweden's 542 billionaires own as much as the poorest 6.2 million Swedes, which is over half the country. And so just shocking statistics, which is couched in a broader narrative over how Sweden became one of the best places in the world to be a billionaire. And as he goes on, and as I think as well, there are a lot of great, economic reasons why this should be the case. It stops significant amount of brain drain and as well maintains some type of domestic investment. However, obviously, there are some shocking statistics which paints a picture for a rather dreary future for the Swedish economy. So just wanted to present that to you and hear your thoughts.
Yeah, those statistics paint a very shocking picture because people think of the Nordic countries as highly egalitarian. They're not. They think of the Nordic countries as operating a successful welfare state model, but that's increasingly being eroded. And I think that inequality is feeding through into an astonishing level of amongst the populations, and I'm thinking now both about Sweden but also about Denmark, a disillusionment with the model, and that a cultural detachment from the previous. I mean, in Denmark and Sweden, Norway, they talk about Juntelöv and this idea of a cohesive society, and everyone I speak to now in the Nordic countries tells me, that's history, pal. It's gone. We are becoming more and more fragmented, less cohesive, disenchanted, racist. It's getting worse, folks. I don't think societies can thrive long term with that level of inequality and that level of debt. For young people, to take on the huge amount of debt necessary to buy property in Sweden, particularly in Stockholm, must be unbearable unless they have the good fortune to have parents who are extraordinarily wealthy or grandparents who are extraordinarily wealthy. And I just don't see how it can be sustainable in the longer term, other than in a very, very small economy where there are huge wealth distributions to make it all work. Otherwise, I just don't see it as being sustainable. And I saw it. I don't think it's directly comparable, but I saw that the effect of extraordinarily expensive housing for those who couldn't afford it here in Britain and in Jersey was that most young people simply couldn't afford it and left, and become very disenchanted and easily prone to the simple solutions of the populists.
On the point of taking on a huge amount of debt, it actually was the case up until just after COVID that interest rates were between 0 and 1%. So the situation that a lot of my friends have is that they purchased a property with very, very low upfront cash. So they didn't even have to ask their parents necessarily for help, but then were locked into these huge debts, which now with variable interest rates are becoming very, very hard to meet. And so you're getting to the end of your monthly paycheck and there's nothing left. And a phenomenon they have is that it's not like culturally, they don't own their place ever. They just keep repaying the debt interest on it. Which is also a different way of thinking about it, but nonetheless, maybe another one of the consequences of this type of economics.
So we increasingly hear politicians talking about, well, we're going to loosen the rules to allow for 35, 40-year mortgages, maybe 50-year mortgages, maybe indefinite mortgages. So you're constantly just paying interest and not paying off the capital. And that's pure rentierism. It leaves young people with very little hope of ever properly owning their property, let alone having the pension provisions, which ordinarily, my generation, the boomer generation, could have expected, let alone all the other things where life was generally improving. They are increasingly victim to high levels of indebtedness, student fees, mortgage, unaffordable mortgages, etc., etc., etc. And I think this is it's widely understood now that generations now growing up who will not benefit in the same way that their parents did from the kind of economic growth experience through the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yeah. Okay, 2 more questions. First being, what is the role that serendipity has played in your life?
I've had enormous privilege. Oh wow! Yes, interesting. I've been able to kind of, in some respects, have a fantastic career on the back of giants. I've mentioned Susan Strange as a kind of someone who inspired me, but at many levels I've been inspired, including the fact that my generation actually grew up in a welfare state which made the most amazing provision, took the risk out of us taking on. We didn't have to take on debt to go to university. So many of us who come from families where no one had ever gone to university went to university, and we had fantastic training, and we had all sorts of provisions which meant that we could do things which our parents and grandparents could never have dreamt of doing. And I think that's been washed away. I don't know whether that's serendipity or something else, but I certainly feel that I have had immense privilege, not just in the kind of the welfare state provision, but in the people I've met, the people who've inspired me, all of that. I think the fact that I grew up in Jersey meant that I had an exceptional insight, particularly when I went back to work there, into this new emerging, brave new world of offshore capitalism and tax havens. And of course, no one for a second would have thought, actually, I was there not so much to make a lot of money, more to look in a very kind of almost scientific sort of way from the inside into a world which is highly secretive. And then build that into initially an academic critique, and then a wider critique and a political critique, and come forward with a whole bunch of proposals for how we could reform the global economy. And then maybe the serendipitous part was in that process was that just as the global financial crisis brought the political game of neoliberalism to a crunch point, we were there with the Tax Justice Network with a whole raft of proposals, and the politicians were clueless about how to react, and we were saying, hey, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. And we were in a position where we were already sufficiently well known to be able to take it straight to G20 and to G7, and our proposals were taken seriously. And I think the fact that we had already created this network of expertise who were in a position to elaborate those policies and put those politicians on the desk, put those policies onto the desk just at the right moment was serendipitous.
Absolutely. And you were the man for it, obviously, having been there in Jersey. That is pure serendipity as well.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely, I think sometimes you need to have a very small bunch of people who spent... I mean, Hunter Thompson said something which I love. He said...
The journalist.
The journalist.
Okay.
He's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and all that. The gonzo journalist. He said, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. And I certainly see that kind of slightly weird focus on tax havens in the 1970s and 1980s, which led through to a kind of whole lifetime spent immersed in this subject of the international financial architecture, turned out to be just the right thing for that moment of the financial crisis.
And finally, we've profiled many countries in this conversation, but if I could ask you one that you're particularly bullish on, which would you think of?
Bullish in what respect? Sorry, I have to ask you that question.
Yeah, not from a purely financial perspective, just that you think it's got a great future ahead of it.
Wow. Can I come back to that one? Because at the moment it all seemed a little bit kind of dire. I'm not actually that much of a pessimist. I think that given the state of current technology globally, and given the fact that many people recognize that neoliberalism has been a failed experiment, and that many people now recognize that if we're going to take advantage of those technologies, new technologies, in ways that are advantageous to the vast majority of people, we need a different political economy. All we need now is a new generation of politicians who can think bravely and act bravely, push back against the corporate powers that control those technologies at the moment, and revert to an economy that works in the interests of the majority rather than the few. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to become communists overnight. Quite the opposite. I'm thinking more about people like Teddy Roosevelt in the United States, who recognized in the late 19th century and early part of the 20th century that monopolies are a bad thing, and introduced extraordinary antitrust things which shaped the kind of capitalism that emerged after World War II, where there were really huge advantages in the welfare of a very large number of people. We just need politicians who have that kind of gumption and intelligence. What we have at the moment is a bunch of witless controlled parties that are controlled by corporate interests.
John, thank you for being so generous with your time, offering me into your home, being such a wonderful guest as well.
Thank you. Pleasure. Really, I've loved it. Could continue.